From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Now, I'm going to be talking to you about a really big topic today. Isabella, the Queen of Castile, who I have come to believe was probably one of the most important women rulers in European history, arguably one of the most important rulers, male or female, in world history. Her life had amazing and sweeping impact on everyone alive today. And one of the challenges of looking at her life is trying to understand the magnitude and the depth of all the ways this woman touched our lives. It's a historic topic, of course, writing a biography about Isabella, but it's also present in each day's news now. And her life was a reflection of what she saw as the core issue of her time, the clash between Islam and Christianity. Now, we have so much to cover today. I'm going to start with a couple preliminary thoughts that I'd like you to mull over during my talk. Then I'm going to do a short reading from the book. Then I'll talk a bit about how I came to write the book. And then I want to show you some pictures and maps that will help you visualize it all better. And then I want to make sure that we leave time for questions, because Isabella's life is a provocative and controversial topic, and I want to have a good bit of time for some give and take about it all. So here's the thought I'd like you all to start with. I want to remind you that up until about 250 years ago, there was no concept of a separation of church and state. In fact, that's the system that still exists in much of the Middle East today. That was the system that we had in the Western world as well at that time. Much of what Isabella did is understandable, not excusable, but understandable when we think about religion and politics from her perspective, that the government is the church and the church is the government. She felt it was her duty to defend and promote the church as much as to defend and promote what was to become the country of Spain. And in fact, one of the things that makes it so poignant that we're here at the Library of Congress today is that it was in the United States 250 years ago that we as a nation first developed the concept of a separation of church and state. You know, remember that in Massachusetts, for example, in the first 100 years of the existence of Massachusetts, church and state were intertwined, and everyone was required to pay taxes to support the church. That led to some really nasty incidents, like the witchcraft trials. We owe the concept of religious tolerance in the United States to the founding fathers, including, most significantly, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who ultimately argued for specific protection for religion in the Bill of Rights. They wanted a specific separation of those two things, and in fact, at that time, they said they were influenced by what had happened in Spain during the Inquisition, which is part of the reason that we have a specifically protected clause for religion. So let's start now, though, by setting our story and its time and place. In a castle on a steep promontory overlooking the windswept plains of north-central Spain, a slender red-haired princess finalized the plans for a ceremony that was likely to throw her nation, already teetering toward anarchy, into full-fledged civil war. Her name was Isabella, and she had just learned that her older brother, King Enrique, known as Enrique el Impotente, which symbolized his failings, both administrative and sexual, had died. King Enrique's lascivious young wife, who had occupied her time bestowing her favors on the other gentlemen of the court, had produced a child, but many people doubted that the king was actually the child's father. Isabella had decided to end the controversy over succession by having herself crowned queen instead. The 23-year-old woman was essentially orchestrating a coup. No woman had ruled the combined kingdoms of Castile and Leon, the largest single realm on the Iberian Peninsula, in more than 200 years. In many European countries, It was in fact illegal for a woman to rule alone. On the rare occasions when women reigned, it was usually as a regent for a son who was too young to govern. Isabella had a husband, Ferdinand, who was heir to the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. But he had been traveling when the news of Enrique's death arrived, and she had decided to seize the initiative. She would take the crown for herself alone. On that bitter cold morning in December 1474, Isabella added the finishing touches to an ensemble intentionally designed to impress onlookers with her splendor and her regal grandeur. She donned an elegant gown encrusted with jewels. A dark red ruby glittered at her throat. Observers already awed by the pageantry now gasped at an additional sight. On Isabella's orders, a court official walked ahead of her horse, holding aloft an unsheathed sword, the naked blade pointing straight upward toward the zenith, in an ancient symbol of the right to enforce justice. It was a dramatic warning gesture, symbolizing Isabella's intent to take power and to use it forcefully. Acknowledging nothing out of the ordinary, Isabella took a seat on an improvised platform in the square. A silver crown was placed upon her head. As the crowd cheered, Isabella was proclaimed queen. Afterwards, she proceeded to Segovia's cathedral. She prostrated herself in prayer before the altar, offering her thanks and imploring God to help her to rule wisely and well. She viewed the tasks ahead as titanic. She believed Christianity was in mortal danger. The Ottoman Turks were aggressively on the march in Eastern and Southern Europe. The Muslims retained an entrenched foothold in the Andalusia kingdom of Granada, which Isabella and others feared would prove a beachhead into the rest of Spain. A succession of popes had pleaded in vain for a steely-eyed commander, a stalwart warrior to step forward to counter the threat. Instead, it was a young woman, the mother of a young daughter, who was taking up the banner. The means she used were effective but brutal. For centuries to come, historians would debate the meaning of her life. Was she a saint or was she satanic? As she stood in the sun in Segovia that winter afternoon, however, she showed no trace of fear or hesitation. Inspired by the example of Joan of Arc, who had died just 2 decades before Isabella was born, and whose stories were much repeated during her childhood, Isabella similarly began to fashion herself as a religious icon. Inwardly infused with a sense of her own destiny, a faith that was fervent, mystical, and intense, Isabella was confident to her core that God was on her side and that he intended her to rule. The questioning would only come much later.